Thank you very much, and thank you again to all of you for being here and for your prayers, which are very important to me as I struggle to compress rather a large quantity of material into rather a small space of time. And it's a privilege to be able to do that with you, and I'm looking forward to the feedback, both from colleagues and perhaps others of you as the day and the week goes on. I'm reminded when I come to this particular topic, and also because of being British and speaking here in an American audience, of a splendid story which the theologian John Bowker told about a time. I knew John quite well. He was Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a famous theological polymath. He was regularly invited to speak in the States, and he used to glance in his diary and see, oh my goodness, I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. What am I talking about? And jot some notes down and would go and do it. It's a mode which I'm not altogether unfamiliar with myself. And on one occasion, he was particularly busy. And as he got on the plane, he saw that the title he'd been given was Speaking of God in Tomorrow's World. And so he got off the plane and straight to the conference, came onto the platform, lots of people there, came in to speak, gave a great lecture, ended up saying that if the doctrine of the Trinity didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. And there was rapturous applause, and he sat down. And the man on the platform next to him said, very daring, very daring. And he said, well, it's pretty orthodox, actually. He said, well, this is a Unitarian conference. And so John said, so why are they all applauding? And he said, oh, they just love your accent. So where we fail as theologians, we may still be here to serve as examples of latent Britishness or something. Anyway, I'm supposed to be talking this morning about Paul's Trinitarian theology, which is huge, massive. But it's unusual and perhaps a bit dangerous to use classic Trinitarian language when speaking of Paul's belief about God, because obviously Paul doesn't use the word Trinity, nor does he use the usual words like substance and nature and person and so on. But as I've studied what Paul says about God and about Jesus and the Spirit over the years, it's become clear to me both that Paul remains very consciously a classic Jewish-style monotheist, and that he discerns Jesus and the Spirit very much within that monotheism, not as it were added on or bolted on to the outside. And that is therefore the obvious place to start in any discussion of his theology seen from within a Jewish context where monotheism is the basic affirmation. Part of our trouble here, I think, in the Western Christian traditions is that most of us who think of ourselves as more or less Orthodox or conservative Christians, yes, we agree with the doctrine of the Trinity, but it often doesn't do much work for us. It often isn't integrated into all the other things that really drive us. We affirm it, and yet it doesn't seem to fit completely well with lots of other things which are more buzzy for us, whether it's atonement or justification or second coming or whatever it is. And I hope I'll be able to show today not only how Paul's Trinitarian theology works in itself, but something about the way in which he puts it immediately to use within this extraordinary idea of this new discipline called Christian, which we call Christian theology, of the whole church thinking wisely, prayerfully, and scripturally about who God is and so on. Now, part of the problem with the classic patristic discussions, I think, is that though I think Paul would have endorsed their conclusions about God, Jesus, the Spirit, and he would have seen that they were fresh statements with new language for a very different culture, I think he would have been anxious that the essentially Jewish context, not least the narrative context in which those beliefs made the sense they did, was being lost or overlooked. And so, though this was not true for the great fathers, there is also lost something of the notion of monotheism, not as an abstract belief, a mental assent to a dogma, but as a commitment, a contested commitment, an act of signing on for a task that would cost not less than everything. We can see this in one of the classic statements of Jewish monotheism, the prayer that the Jews call the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That prayer from Deuteronomy 6 was and remains central to Jewish life and devotion. It structures the day of the devout Jew. You pray it morning, noon, and night. It centers the thinking of the devout Jew. It energizes the commitment of the devout Jew. My favorite example comes from a century after Jesus, when the noble Rabbi Akiba, one of the greatest rabbis of all time, had supported Simeon ben Koziba in his rebellion against the Emperor Hadrian's brutal anti-Jewish legislation. Akiba had hailed ben Koziba as Messiah. He'd called him the son of the star, Bar Kokhba. And for 3 brief years, amazingly, they established a small independent Jewish state. They thought this was the beginning of the kingdom of God. They even minted coins with the year 1, and then the next year 2, and then the next year 3, and that was it. Rather like the French Revolutionary, they started the calendar again. And then, as in AD 69 and 70, so in 135, the Romans closed in and did what they always did. And as they were torturing Akiba to death, so the later stories tell us, they were combing his flesh with steel combs, not a nice way to die. And he was praying the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love him with all your heart and mind and strength and life. And when the rabbis talk of someone praying the Shema, they say that such a person is taking upon himself the yoke of the kingdom, signing on. And in such a circumstance, this is strikingly obvious. Akiba was continuing to invoke and uphold the kingdom of the one true God against the kingdom of the pagan idolaters. That's what monotheism means. It was a last act of protest. It was a witness. Some of Akiba's disciples were standing there watching him being tortured to death. And they said, Rabbi, how can you go on praying that even now? And Akiba's answer ought to be engraved in letters of fire. He said, all my life I have loved him with my heart and my mind and my strength. And I have wondered what it would mean to love him with my life. And now that I have the chance, shall I not take it? And he died with the words, Echad, one, on his lips. That's what monotheism meant in this period. Wasn't a philosophical analysis of the being of the one God. It was an affirmation made in the teeth of pagan power and oppression that Israel's God, the Creator, was the one and only God, and that one was going to love and serve him come what may. And that is the monotheism for which Paul likewise embraced, by and for which he lived, and for which, so strongly attested legend says, he too gave his life. But how did monotheism, so to speak, work? Here we have to remind ourselves of the very particular dynamic of Jewish belief about God. It's fatally easy for us. We live in still a predominantly Epicurean or deist framework with a distant, remote God who's in danger of being so remote that he ceases to exist at all. That's our cultural milieu ever since the 18th century Enlightenment, and however much we Christians try and struggle within it, that's the kind of default mode to which our culture goes back. Within that, it's easy to imagine that monotheism simply names this distant or remote God as, well, there's only one of him. And that's why it often appears as a detached dogma. For many people, when they speak of the triune God, that's what they mean. Well, that distant, remote God, there's actually three as well as one, whatever that means. And we either affirm or deny that strange idea and then get on with other business. But the whole point of Jewish monotheism was that it was radically different from Epicureanism, which is not a modern worldview, it's an ancient one. There are very few actual modern worldviews. They're just reprises or different versions of things that were tried out many centuries before. When this living God revealed himself to Abraham, Abraham built altars and invoked him. They met, they talked. God made a covenant and came down in a fiery symbol, Genesis 15, to pass through the divided sacrificial animals. This is a very dangerous God. This is not a remote God. And spectacularly, God acted in power and in person to deliver his people from Egypt. And then, despite the sin of the golden calf, he came to live with his people in person in the tabernacle set up outside the camp. And that gave way in the passing centuries, ambiguously but importantly, to the temple in Jerusalem. This God was not absent or remote. He made his glory, his Shekinah, dwell in the midst of his people, so that the coming of the divine glory in Exodus 40 is repeated with the coming of the divine glory to Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 8. And that remains basic to all Israelite monotheism. There is one God who made the whole world, and he lives right here. But with the exile, all that changed. Ezekiel's glorious opening vision of the divine throne chariot turns to disaster as the idolatry and wickedness of the priests finally drives God to anger and despair, and the throne chariot with its whirling wheels leaves the temple and departs for realms unknown. That, of course, is why the Babylonians can come in and destroy the temple. But Ezekiel, in that strange dreamlike sequence at the end of his book, prophesies that the temple will be rebuilt and the divine glory will return at last. You see the same in Isaiah 40 and 52. The good news, the gospel, and this is the biblical root of that phrase, the Evangelion in the Septuagint, is precisely in Isaiah 40 and 52 that Yahweh is coming back at last. The mountains and the hills are being flattened and the valleys filled in to make a smooth path for Yahweh to come back. I must have sung in Handel's Messiah 24 times as boy and man before it ever occurred to me to ask, what does that first chorus actually mean? And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. It means Yahweh is going to come back visibly in the sight not only of Israel, but all the nations. Your watchmen, says Isaiah in 52, lift up their voices and shout for joy, because in plain sight they see Yahweh returning to Zion. Let's be quite clear. We get the same predictions in Zechariah and Malachi as well. In other words, long after the exiles had returned and had rebuilt the temple. Here's the puzzle. At no point in the Second Temple period did anyone say that the Shekinah, the divine glory, had returned to the temple in Jerusalem. Indeed, a much later rabbi comments, looking back, that there were various ways in which the Second Temple was inferior to Solomon's temple. Tellingly, one of the most important of those ways is that the Shekinah was never there. It was Hamlet without the prince. The house was uninhabited. Oh, of course, there was still a sense of presence. As with an old and empty church, you can still sense that this is a place of worship. This is a place where God has shown up in the past and might do so again. They still worshipped in the temple. The early Christians worshipped in the temple. But there was no sense, nobody ever said that those promises of divine return in glory had come true. The closest you get, interestingly, I was talking to a friend who's a Second Temple expert a couple of years ago about this, and he thought for a moment and said, well, the main exception would be Ben Sira 24, that's Ecclesiasticus 24, where something like the divine glory is indeed found in the temple, but it turns out to be the figure of wisdom, and wisdom turns out to be the teaching of Torah. That indeed explains an interesting phenomenon. From the time of the Babylonian exile and continuing in the wider Jewish diaspora, the Torah, the law, functioned as it were as a portable temple, so that where two or three sat together and studied the Torah, the Shekinah would dwell with them. Indeed, a great deal of Second Temple Judaism, such as the movements of both apocalyptic, properly so called, and mysticism, appear in a new light when we consider this unfulfilled expectation of Yahweh's return. And when we turn to the New Testament, we find that Mark and John most obviously, and Matthew and Luke arguably, take this as the starting point for their Christology. John, the Word became flesh, kai eskenosan en hemin, kai etheasamathet en doxan autu. The Word became flesh and tabernacled, pitched his tent in our midst, and we beheld his glory. Very clear, John is saying that which Isaiah had prophesied, Ezekiel had prophesied, Malachi had prophesied, has come true in Jesus. Mark starts his gospel with explicit quotes from Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3, and then shows us Jesus coming for baptism. But what would it look like when Yahweh finally returned? Here there was a puzzle to which the four Gospels give their various answers in terms of Jesus. One of the models remains that of the Exodus. The pillar of cloud and fire leads the people through the wilderness to their inheritance. A great deal of the New Testament presents the events of Jesus and the Spirit precisely in terms of a new Exodus. The real return from exile will be the new release from slavery, and not least the return of Yahweh to dwell among his people once for all. This, I now want to suggest, is the heart of Paul's vision, both of Jesus and of the Spirit. As we get to the heart of this topic, I hope the way I've set it up makes it clear that Paul's vision of Jesus and the Spirit and their relation to the one God of Israel is very far from being an abstract or dry dogmatic principle. As I say, so often Trinitarian theology is perceived that way, but for Paul, this is the very lifeblood of the church, the very bone marrow which enables it to live and work for God's kingdom. Let's take for a start that remarkable passage I alluded to at the end last night, Philippians 2. Despite some earlier protests, it is widely acknowledged that in Philippians 2, 6-11, we have a fully incarnational theology. This means that either already with Paul or even earlier with some pre-Pauline poet who he's quoting. We don't know if that's what it was, but it's always possible. You know the passage. He, being in the form of God, did not regard his equality with God as something to exploit, something to take advantage of. He was obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So God has highly exalted him and given him the name above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus the Messiah is Lord, Kyrios, to the glory of God the Father. There, as elsewhere in Paul, Kyrios is the Kyrios of the Septuagint, which in the Septuagint is the Greek way of rendering the divine name. Most people are now happy to say that here, Paul and the pre-Pauline poem, if that's what it is, remain agnostic on that, here accord Jesus a fully divine status. What is not always noticed is how Paul gets there and what he does with it. See, so often Christians are content to put a check by the box, is Jesus or is Jesus not divine? Yeah, check. Okay, I'm a Christian, I'm okay. But the point is not, yes, he's divine. It's what is this embodied God up to? That's the key issue which the New Testament addresses. First, the key biblical reference here is Isaiah 45:23, in which Yahweh himself says that to him and him alone every knee will bow and every tongue will swear. Yahweh will not share his glory with another. That's Isaianic monotheism. But he has now shared it with Jesus. That is explosive enough. But of course, as I've said, part of the whole point of Isaiah 40-55, one of its structuring and central themes is precisely the return of Yahweh to Zion in the new Exodus, which is also the real return from exile. How will that happen? Strangely and powerfully in Isaiah 40-55. It'll happen through the work and the suffering and the death of the servant of the Lord. Paul is drawing on, alluding to, and compressing into a short poem that entire theme. In the same way, in Colossians 1:15-20, that other great Pauline or pre-Pauline poem, we find a new Exodus context. He's delivered us from the kingdom of darkness, restored us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And we find particularly a new temple claim, that in him all the fullness of deity dwells bodily. Colossians 1 and actually Colossians 2, it's repeated. This is temple language, reinforced in chapter 2 and in other Pauline passages. This is how Paul conceives of Jesus, as the one in whom the God who had promised to return to his people had in fact come back to dwell in their midst. What would it look like? It would look like Jesus, and particularly Jesus crucified and risen. But when we go back to Philippians 2, we find, as Old Testament theology might lead us to expect, that this extraordinary claim is put to work in the formation of a community. The poem stands where it stands in Philippians 2 as the ultimate motive and pattern for the mutual love and submission that will bring unity to the church, Philippians 2, 1-5. The most extraordinary appeal for unity anywhere. I sometimes used to read that whole passage out to colleagues in Durham and say, are we anywhere near this, being in full accord and of one mind and sharing a common fellowship and sharing a common attitude to everything and deferring to one another and so on? It's an amazing appeal for the humility which brings unity and for that mutual submission which must go on all the time. Philippians 2, therefore, as a whole chapter, is a wonderful working model of the thesis I'm presenting to you overall, because the poem in the middle of the chapter is in the service of the unity of the church in verses 1-5 and the holiness of the church in verses 12-18. There's a nice sermon for you if you're short of something to say next Sunday. The central command, backing up what I said last night, is that we should have the same mind as was in the Messiah. Tommy Givens brought that out in his very helpful comments last night, that Paul says, think this way among yourselves as you have or as you are in the Messiah. It's an odd little condensed form. Paul wants you to think in this new way so that the church can be united and then that it can be holy. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, we have the Messiah's mind. And in Philippians 2, he explains what that looks like. The highest possible Christology is linked directly to the mind which consists of the consolation of love, the compassion and sympathy, the humility and service, which we see in the Messiah himself, and which is the pathway towards ecclesial unity. And that same Christology then, in verses 12-18, is in the service of the community working out its own salvation with fear and trembling and shining like stars in a dark night. That passage already alerts us to another feature of Philippians 2, which is again dependent precisely on its high Christology. There's a sharp contrast here between the Messiah and the normal pattern of kingly rulers in Paul's world, from Alexander the Great on through reaching new heights, or perhaps we should say depths, in the Roman emperors of Paul's own day. When Paul declares what the Messiah did not do regarding his divine equality as something to exploit and so on, he is describing the normal way that emperors behaved, much as Jesus himself explained in Mark chapter 10. And when Paul tells the Philippians that they must work out their own salvation, he isn't talking about justification or anything like that. He is saying, Caesar offers the world a soteria, a salvation, a regular imperial world. Caesar claims to have rescued the world from disaster and to have brought peace and prosperity. Caesar says, follow me and you'll have soteria. Paul says, you who follow Jesus have a different kind of soteria, and you have to figure out what that salvation means, and you have to put it in practice on the street so that the different way of being human, modeled on the radically different way of being God, which we see in Jesus, will make its impact like a new star in the night sky. This already tells us that Paul's Christology is nothing if not practical. He wants people to think through this rich theology of the way in which Israel's God has returned to his people in the person of the crucified Messiah, so that they can then be the united and holy community which will demonstrate to the world who God is and hence what it means to be genuinely human, made in his image. The other passage I'm going to consider here as part of Paul's Christology, we could go on all day about this, has the same wonderful practical application. In Philippians 2, as we've seen, Paul takes one of the most fierce monotheistic passages in Scripture, Isaiah 45, and he discovers Jesus in the middle of it. But in the other passage I'm going to look at, 1 Corinthians 8, he has, if anything, gone one better. He has taken the classic prayer of Jewish monotheism, the kingdom-invoking Shema, which Akiba prayed as they tortured him to death. And here he has discovered Jesus in the middle of that monotheistic, kingdom-invoking prayer. Again, 1 Corinthians 8:6 is anything but a detached statement of dogma. It is a part, the driving and central part of an argument, again for the unity and the holiness of the church. I hope you see how this is playing out. And here's the problem that he faced. The little Christian community in Corinth had taken Paul seriously, or some of them had, in learning that they had to abandon the ubiquitous and powerful culture of idolatry. I suspect we don't emphasize this enough, but it's clear from 1 Thessalonians and lots of other places that the summons to turn from idols and serve a true and living God was basic to all Paul's preaching. The basic Jewish monotheism. Idols are bad for you, they don't exist, they mess everything up, turn from them to serve the one true and only God. The gospel was first and foremost a message about God, about the true God, the one God of Jewish monotheism, who is establishing his kingdom on earth as in heaven through the strange means of the gospel. But if people take this command seriously, and then they remind themselves that almost all the meat on sale in a town like Corinth had come from the back door of one of the many temples, in other words, that it had already been offered in sacrifice to an idol, what then? Should they all become vegetarians? Some people think that the Jewish Christians would have said that. I'm not so sure. I think it's just as likely, if not more so, that the people who wanted to get as far away from idolatry as they could were rather the Gentile converts who, having discovered the new way of being human in the Messiah, wanted nothing whatever to do with their former way of life. I was reminded as I was writing this of my father, who gave up smoking when I was a teenager, and for years afterwards, if anyone came to the house and lit up a pipe or a cigarette, he would noisily go around throwing open windows and doors and generally sort of flapping about, making his revulsion felt. I think that's how many Gentile Christians in Corinth felt about idol meat. That's a horrible way to be. It messed us up, and we don't want anything more to do with it. Whatever, Paul cannot simply go along with that and play safe, because that is the high road to dualism, to a denial of the goodness of the created order, which is one of the central features of creational monotheism. Indeed, as in his teaching about marriage, so here also Paul is teaching and celebrating the goodness of creation, something not all would-be Pauline Christians have fully grasped. So Paul wants to make it clear, okay, idols are man-made non-entities. Zeus, Athene, and the rest, they don't exist. So the meat is still part of God's good world. And if you thank God for it, that's fine. The argument actually goes all the way to chapter 10, where Paul triumphantly quotes Psalm 24, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." That psalm, however, goes on to make it clear that those who want to ascend the hill of the one God, in other words, those who are the temple people, which for Paul has a new meaning now in Christ and the Spirit, they are to be holy. So here is Paul navigating his way to a statement of a non-dualistic holiness, which is a robust and God-reflecting monotheism. Got it? But there is another problem as well, not only holiness, but also unity. Some Christians have eagerly embraced Paul's teaching about the non-existence of idols. They are quite happy to take what he calls the strong position. Hey, that's great, these idols don't exist, so we can eat any meat we like. These are just irrelevant buildings, so we can go in and out of them, and it really doesn't matter because idols don't exist. And Paul says, hang on, there are other people who are very bothered about this. Paul is a pastor, and he knows that you can't hurry people's consciences. You can point things out to them and pray with them, but they may still have doubts and scruples. I'm just not going to touch that stuff. It reminds me of the old life, and I don't want to go near it. Some of you will know the famous theologian Jim Packer, J.I. Packer. Jim Packer, when he was converted as a student, was playing in a jazz band, playing the clarinet in the jazz band. And he told me this himself, that for years he gave up jazz because the way of life which he associated with jazz simply was part of what he'd left behind in the gospel. And then he said one day he felt the Lord saying to him that it was now okay to get out his clarinet and start playing again. And in fact, one time I met Jim at a conference in New York, and we were discussing which jazz clubs were doing what and which we were going to that night and so on. And he'd managed to find his way back in a non-dualistic way, having got through that earlier period of a necessary renunciation. It's that kind of pastoral situation that Paul is going with. Such people in their scruples are to be loved and honored. And if that means that when you're having dinner with them, you go vegetarian, then so be it, so as not to lure them back into idolatry. I wish this complex and subtle position had been thought through in the Western churches these last generations. We've badly needed it. But my point here is this. Here is Paul facing complex, practical pastoral issues, which ultimately are to do with the unity of the church and the holiness of the church. He's determined to teach the practice of creational monotheism, which alone can sort all this out. So naturally, he goes back to the basic monotheistic prayer, the Shema. But what does he do? He discovers Jesus in the middle of it. 1 Corinthians 8, you can say we all have knowledge. Well, knowledge puffs you up, but love builds you up. And if you think you know something, he's teasing the Corinthians about their own slogans. If you think you know something, you don't actually know anything yet. But if you love God, you are known by him. See how he turns it round. Loving God, what's that? The Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God. Are we sure that's that reference? Yes, because he immediately goes on, no idol really exists, and there is no God but one. All right, there may be so-called gods and so-called lords, but for us, and here is the Shema, only it's the Shema like you've never heard it before. For us, there is one God, one Lord, one God, the Father, from whom are all things and we to him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and we through him. You see it better if you hear it in the Septuagint and then in Paul's Greek, because it's very, very close. In the Septuagint, it's akouê Israel, kyrios ho theos hemon, kyrios his estin. And Paul says, alhemin his theos ho pater exut ha panta kai hemis is auton, kai his kyrios, Jesus Christos, dihut ha panta kai hemis diautu. One God, one Lord. That's Paul taking the central prayer of Jewish monotheism and unfolding it so that we find Jesus inside it. For Paul, Jesus is part of the inner life and love of the one God of creational monotheism. He is not an added extra or a demigod stuck on the outside. He is the personal expression and presence of the one God. And Paul immediately applies this to the unity of the church in chapter 8. Because the crucified Jesus is part of the meaning of the word God, then God's people must love one another and give up their rights for one another. It's the same point as in Philippians 2. Revised monotheism means revised community. Then when it comes to holiness, Paul is quite clear in chapter 10. He goes back, as he so often does, to the story of the Exodus. He explains that God, to put it mildly, was not pleased with the wilderness generation, and so he won't be pleased with the new wilderness generation if they mess about as well in the ways that always accompany idolatry. In particular, he contrasts the table of the Lord with the table of demons. Okay, this is a subtle point. The idols, Zeus, Athene, Poseidon, whoever, they don't exist, but there are these nasty, spiteful little things called demons who hang out in the idol temples, like sort of messy little squatters camping in some great palatial residence. And they lure worshippers into dehumanizing behavior. And he says, you can't eat at the Lord's table and the demons' tables. You are the new Exodus people. You are the people who, in worshiping the one God, one Lord, are now distinct from Jew and Gentile alike. Renewed monotheism generates renewed election and ecclesiology, as we'll see this evening. But what Paul is doing throughout this 3-chapter section of the letter, 8, 9, and 10, is teaching them to think theologically, teaching them to think through who the true God really is, and hence how to live together. And this is what I mean by the theological task, the whole church learning to think differently as a task which will then directly serve the holiness and the unity of that church. Now, there are many other passages we could consider under the same heading. In particular, it would be important at some point in a full treatment to look at Paul's use of the phrase Son of God. That's just massive. I'm just going to stop on one passage for a moment because it makes these points so well and it serves as a transition to the second half of this lecture, which is about the Spirit. I refer to Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Here again we have an Exodus narrative. Paul tells the story of Israel and the world in terms of a young son who, though he's the heir to the whole estate, is kept under lock and key no better than a slave until the time of his maturity. Paul is deliberately echoing the plight of Israel, both in Egypt and then in exile, promised an inheritance but forced to wait for it through centuries of slavery. And by the way, the reason he's telling this like this is that in the previous chapter, he's talked about Genesis 15, where God promises Abraham a family and a land, but he says that the family will have to wait for nearly half a millennium in slavery before they get the land. Anyway, in Galatians 4, Paul expounds what you might call the new Exodus. 4:4, when the time had fully come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law. Redemption is the language of Exodus, so that we might receive the adoption as sons. Keep the masculine sons there because Paul wants it to resonate with Exodus 4:22. Israel is my son, my firstborn. And then he says, because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer slaves, but sons, and if sons, then heirs through God. The point at issue for the Galatians is, are we or are we not children of Abraham? Are we part of the family, part of the inheritance that God promised to Abraham? The false teachers have tried to claim that you can only get the inheritance by being a true child of Abraham, by being circumcised and keep the Mosaic law. Paul is saying, no, the Messiah's crucifixion has radically redrawn the map of God's people. I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. And so once again, the problem Paul is facing is that of unity. The trouble in Antioch, Galatians 2, had centered on the actions of Peter and the others who'd split the church down the middle so that you had a Jewish Christian table over here and a Gentile Christian table over there. Is that what the gospel was supposed to generate? Of course not. That's what Paul is talking about in Galatians 2 on justification. And the entire argument of Galatians 3 is that God has one family, not two, that Abraham has one family, not two, and that single family consists of all those who believe in the gospel of the Messiah. Here in the LA greater area, I can't resist telling you a story that reminds me of, which took place here in Los Angeles nearly 20 years ago when I was at a conference. I was having dinner with a Canadian scholar called Lloyd Gaston, who disagreed with me radically about Paul. And we were having a great conversation over dinner with Galatians 3 open on the desk in Greek and having a good time. And the waitress came to take our dessert order. And the waitress was a lady from another culture. I'm not sure whether she was Mexican or African American. I just remember as a little but large lady, if you know what I mean. And she came to take our dessert order, and Lloyd Gaston looked up at her and said, Galatians 3 and ice cream, please. And she said, what was that? And he said, Galatians 3 and ice cream, please. And she swung around at me and said, what are you two talking about? And I said, well, my friend here would disagree, but I think that in Galatians 3, Paul is saying that God has one family, not two, and that family consists of all those who believe in Jesus. And she swung around at Lloyd and said, and you don't believe that? Listen, buddy, I'm a born-again Christian. The Bible is the word of God. If you don't believe that, you're going to hell. And then she went off to get the ice cream. So I hope that fixes Galatians 3 in your mind for you. It certainly does for me. So what has Paul done? He has told a new Exodus story. And at the point in the story where Yahweh says, I have heard the cry of my people and I am coming down to rescue them. At that point in the story, Paul has the sending of the Son. And at the point of the story where God is leading the people through the wilderness to their inheritance, in person, Paul has the Spirit. Once you think, as Paul is doing in terms of a new Exodus story, once you see the role that Yahweh played himself in that story, and then the roles that Jesus and the Spirit play in Paul's revised story, you have such a high view of Jesus and the Spirit that any theologian anywhere would be happy with it. From this point of view, like John Bowker said, if the doctrine of the Trinity didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. And this is teaching people to think within God's story in order that they can learn to be united as a single family. This is practical whole church theology in the service of unity at the table. And then watch what happens. Paul rams the point home, Galatians 4:8-11. He contrasts the God that they have thus come to know with the weak and beggarly elements of the world to whom they were formerly enslaved. This is a clever and subtle piece of reasoning, but at its heart, this is what it means. Now that you've learned this story of God sending the Son and the Spirit, why you have come to know God, or rather, he says, correcting himself like in 1 Corinthians 8, you've come to be known by God. God retains the initiative. But this God, the one who sends the Son and the Spirit, is then contrasted with the worldly elements who, like the demons in 1 Corinthians, are wanting to lure you back into their world. And this means, again, this dramatically revised monotheistic theology is once again in the service not only of unity but also of holiness. We cannot emphasize too strongly against those whose basic analysis of Paul is purely in terms of law over here and grace over here, with all the dangers of antinomianism that generates to this day. That for Paul, the very center of Christian living was the worship of the one true God, and hence the renunciation of idols and the behavior associated with them. Worshipping the one true God always meant being renewed and restored as genuine human beings. And if somebody says, oh, that's so much law and we prefer grace, say, no, this is about worship. There is a sense that what Paul is offering the world is actually, as a friend of mine puts it, Judaism for Gentiles. That statement could be misunderstood, and that's actually an oversimplification. But it's true if we mean that Paul is teaching his churches that in the Messiah and the Spirit, the one God has made himself known so that they must renounce idols and idol-like behavior and come through their worship to discern what God's will actually is. Straight back once more to Romans 12. So that for Paul, this revised monotheism is not a bare intellectual assent. As we've seen, it's severely practical, but it begins first and foremost as a summons to worship. The Epicureans, okay, there may be one God, but they don't worship him because he's so far away. He doesn't care and we don't care about him. The Stoics, well, they're pantheists, so there is only one God, but we're part of that divinity, or it's part of us. And so worship means something quite different, though some of the Stoics actually were better than their own theory, but that's another story. But if you believe in the God of the Exodus, and still more the God of the new Exodus, the primary response is glad and grateful worship and the unity and holiness of the community, which grows out of that as we are transformed by the renewing of the mind together, not just some people with degrees or whatever, the whole church. That points to many, many other places where Paul discusses the Spirit. I could happily spend a long time with Romans 8 here. I'm actually going to impose a self-denying ordinance and leave that to later on this evening and tomorrow, God willing. But there are many other relevant passages. Think of 1 Corinthians 12, where just at the point where Paul wants to say that the church is one, he says it in three different ways. Varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. Varieties of service, but the same Lord. Varieties of operation, but the same God. Hang on, Paul, you're trying to teach us that we are all one in Christ. Yes, but when I say that, I say it these three ways. Again, this is Trinitarian theology in the service of the unity of the church. Let me just take you, though, to 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, an amazing, difficult but amazing passage. Here Paul once again envisages the church as the people of the new Exodus, the people of the new covenant, as in Jeremiah or Ezekiel. The Spirit has written the law on their hearts, and remember that the law is to do with the personal presence of Yahweh in this period of Jewish history, taking, as it were, the presence of, the place of the Shekinah in the temple. Paul is working with that complex of themes because he takes the golden calf incident from Exodus, which is the odd prelude then to Yahweh coming finally and dwelling in the newly built tabernacle once he's forgiven them for the golden calf. That the graciousness of God and the prayer of Moses mean that God does come after all and to dwell there and lead them to their inheritance. Paul takes this as the model in the new Exodus of the Spirit dwelling within believers, so that the divine glory is visible to the eye of faith in the heart-to-heart and face-to-face boldness of apostolic preaching and teaching and community life. And this then extends into that spectacular passage, 2 Corinthians 4, 1-6. The God of this world has blinded the minds, notice the minds of the unbelievers, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory, note the glory, of the Messiah who is the image of God. So now we're putting the new Genesis with the new Exodus, making the renewed monotheism in one glorious and life-giving Pauline sentence. He says, we don't proclaim ourselves, but Jesus the Messiah as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for his sake, because the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus the Messiah. Can imagine Paul, when he'd written that sentence, thinking, yes, I've said it, that's what it's all about. Renewed monotheism by gospel, Messiah, and Spirit in the service of the apostolic ministry and the vocation of the church. That's what it's all about. I'm sort of nearly done, but I hope the basic point is made and is clear. There's masses of other stuff we could do. And if you knew how much self-effort it takes to keep Romans out of this discussion, it's quite something. Some of my reviewers have said you spend far too much time in Romans. Well, okay, Romans is one of the greatest books ever written, but just for this moment, I'm holding back. But what I want to do now in conclusion is twofold, in line with the somewhat over-ambitious title that this lecture was given. I want first just to note the question of pluralism and clashing kingdoms, and then look in slightly more detail at the way in which this gospel of revised monotheism generates a new vision of the problem of evil, the problem to which the doctrine of election, this evening's subject, is Paul's spectacular answer. So first, a couple of words about pluralism and empire. The gospel was born, of course, into a world of radical and multiple religious pluralism. The pagan world was full of all kinds of gods and goddesses and divinities and religious systems and goodness knows what. The pluralism wasn't quite open-ended. As Socrates discovered, you could get into trouble if you introduced foreign divinities into a city, because the city's own gods might feel that somebody was trying to take the place over. But in general, the ancient Greco-Roman world had plenty of room for new cults and new movements, plenty of claimants to various divine or semi-divine powers. And of course, in the middle of it all, not competing with the others, but taking quite a leading place, was the new cult of Rome and the emperor, which took different forms in different parts of the empire, but was one of the fastest growing religious movements around. Paul, in his letters and in his famous speech in Acts 17, is quite blunt. There are many gods and lords, but for us there is one God, one Lord. There are many temples, but they're a category mistake, because the living God doesn't live in man-made houses. So where does he live? In our midst, in the person of Jesus, Paul would reply, and in our hearts and lives, not least our corporate life, in the person of the Spirit. Does that therefore mean that all religions are as wrong as they could be? No, they all take some aspect of the truth and hang on to that and distort it. But when you learn to worship the true God revealed in Jesus, then you will find that the things you're offered in the other great religions or the lesser religions of Paul's world in distorted forms are given to you in Jesus in their true form, which turn out again and again to be the form of utter self-giving love, the love revealed on the cross. If you look at the religions in the ancient world, I couldn't say about religions in the modern world, but look at religions in the ancient world, what Paul is talking about stands out as radically different at that point again and again. Much more one could say about that, but not now. This points on, though, to Paul's vision of the political realm, because as he goes about establishing and strengthening communities loyal to Kyrios Jesus, Jesus as Lord, he is very much aware that he is doing this under the nose of Kyrios Kaiser, Caesar the Lord. This case has sometimes been overstated. As I say in chapter 12 of my book, we were all very enthusiastic about suddenly discovering the political implications of Paul's writings in the early 1990s, and we've explored various things, and rather like letting a garden grow wild for a bit, it's now time to come along and say, actually, we need to trim this a bit and reshape this and perhaps prune that entirely, whatever. But there is a reality there which is still very important. When Paul uses imperial language about Jesus, gospel, savior, Lord, etc., all well-known words in the imperial cult and language and on the coins and so on, he hasn't derived these words from the Caesar cult. He's got them from the Old Testament. That's quite clear in his quotations. But he must know that this language confronts the claims of Caesar at every turn. The higher your Christology, the sharper your conflict with the principalities and powers. And Caesar is pretty senior among that lot. And that's why, if I can put it like this, the sight of a doctrinally conservative Christianity, strongly affirming the divinity of Jesus, but not wanting to see that in any way to do with a confrontation with political authority, that strikes me as wanting to have your cake and eat it. The thing is that in the New Testament, the high claims that are made throughout about Jesus are not there to be dogmatic shibboleths. As I say, it's possible to tick all the boxes, but then to join them up in the wrong order, like a child doing a follow-the-dots puzzle without paying attention to the numbers, and so generating a donkey instead of an elephant or vice versa. In the New Testament, Jesus is hailed as God's second self because in and through Jesus, God is taking his power and reigning. But get this, incarnational theology is the key in which the music is set, but the tune is that God is becoming king. As always, the kingdom of God confronts the kingdoms of the world, not with superior power, but with a radically different form of power, the power of love. But mention of that clash projects me forwards into the final mini topic of this lecture. Just as if you're a creational and covenantal monotheism, you are bound to have some sort of eschatology. Monotheism plus election equals eschatology, remember from last night. So this kind of monotheism, Paul's kind, necessarily generates a vision of what's wrong with the world, what God needs to put right if he really is God. And this is where in Pauline studies over the last 30 years, we've had this debate about the problem and the solution. Did Paul start with a problem? I know I'm a sinner. I know I'm morally imperfect. What am I going to do? How can I get to heaven? Here's the gospel. Fine, that solves my problem. Or did Paul start, as he seems to start in Philippians 3, by saying, I'm a very good Jew, I'm absolutely top of the tree, touching the righteousness of God, righteousness under the law, I'm perfect, I'm absolutely fine. And then, on the road to Damascus, be confronted with the fact that God had done something radically new, so that he now realized, I must have had a problem somewhere and I didn't know it. That's the standoff that we've had in scholarship over the last 30 years on this. But in fact, of course, as usual, the answer is both and not either or. Every first century Jew, certainly every zealous Pharisee, knew that there were major problems in the world. The pagans were running the show and the Jews weren't keeping Torah properly. And if God were to act to fulfill his promises, he'd have to deal with those two issues. The problem of illegitimate power in the wider world that has taken over God's good creation, and the problem of sin within the people of God themselves. This has a familiar shape, of course, the problem of sin in Genesis 3, the problem of arrogance and empire in Genesis 11, and in between them, with echoes which maybe Paul is picking up, the strange beings, supra or subhuman, who invade the world in Genesis 6. Some theologians try to play these off against one another. Human sin in Genesis 3, invasive powers in Genesis 6, arrogance of empire in Genesis 11. Seems to me that they all belong together. What Paul is concerned with is that his revised monotheism has generated a sharper vision of all three. We were aware of them all vaguely before, even though Paul himself thought that as a good Jew he was rising above that lot. But actually, now he sees the depth of sin, the depth of what the invasive powers have done, the depth of arrogance and empire. And it's the answer to all of those that he finds in the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promises. That's how he's reading Genesis. Very brief explanation of this. If you say that there is one God, then it is a puzzle for you as to why there is sin, why there is political oppression, why there are dark and hidden forces that seem to compel humans to do horrible things. But if you then say that this one God is revealed in the crucified and risen Jesus, then you have to face the fact that the problem was far worse than you'd realize. You went to the doctor with a common cold and he's recommending immediate heart surgery. Saul of Tarsus heads off to Damascus to address the problem of apostasy among Jewish communities. But then he's confronted by the risen Jesus, and he realizes that the problem is far, far worse than just a few idiots who are worshiping this would-be Messiah. It wasn't just Gentile sin, it was the sin of the whole human race going all the way back to Adam himself, and that means including in Israel itself. It isn't just wicked pagan rulers and people colluding with them. It's dark powers that have taken over the world. Ultimately, the forces that he calls sin with a capital S in our language and death with a capital D. Paul uses the words hamartia and thanatos in a way which we have to take like that, not just individual sin and death, but actually these are forces and powers. And the answer to it all is the cross of Jesus the Messiah and the fresh gift of the Spirit. Paul learns about the true nature of the multi-layered problem of evil, even as he learns about the divinely appointed solution in the cross and the Spirit. Again, lots of resonances in Romans 8 here. God has condemned sin in the flesh so that the just decree of Torah might be fulfilled in us who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. There I'm back in Romans, despite my best intentions. The same gospel which unveils the righteousness of God, and therefore the free gift of salvation, Romans 1:16 and 17, also unveils for the first time the full depth and horror of the problem of sin and divine wrath, Romans 1:18. Not that it was completely unknown before, but that now in the light of the gospel of the crucified Messiah, we see it in all its tortuous, worm-ridden, human-destroying horror. And this is why, to tie together the loose ends of this lecture, only 2 minutes after schedule, Paul's revised monotheism plays the role that it does in his gospel. Because it's only when you see who the true God is that you realize, as in Galatians 4, the depth of enslavement to which humanity had sunk, and the challenge, therefore, to worship this true God, the one who sent the Son and who sent the Spirit of the Son, rather than the idols who were the former slave masters. The full Pauline picture of the one God is not a mere dogmatic prelude to a soteriology which is about something else. If you even glimpse the true God, the result must be the call to worship, which consists not least of renouncing idols so that you can celebrate and affirm God's mighty acts, particularly his mighty acts in raising Jesus from the dead and enthroning him as Lord of the world. And in that celebration and affirmation, which is the heart of all Christian worship, we find the renunciation of idolatry, the turning away from other gods and lords, the grateful recognition that on the cross God has dealt with sin and its consequences, and the joyful news that in that same event, God has overthrown the principalities and powers and has led them as a defeated rabble in the triumphal procession of the Messiah. This is what Paul means when he says that if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be justified and saved. But since that has already taken us well into the territory of election and of the reframed soteriology which lies at its heart, we will postpone further discussions of such things to the next lecture where it properly belongs. Thank you.